On August 17, 1829, the Charleston District Court received a peculiar request from William Thornton Hayes, a plantation owner whose property bordered the Combahee River in South Carolina. Hayes demanded the immediate arrest of 7 of his enslaved men, claiming they had conspired to escape through what he described as an underground passage of impossible engineering. The case file, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, contains testimonies so detailed and disturbing that historians have debated their authenticity for nearly 2 centuries. But what makes this case truly haunting isn't the tunnel itself. It's what the investigators found inside it. And more importantly, what they found living inside it. The official investigation began when Hayes noticed something peculiar about his cotton yields. Section D of his plantation, closest to the river, had been underperforming for 3 consecutive seasons. The soil seemed depleted, the plants growing in uneven patches, as though something beneath the ground was interfering with root development. Agricultural experts he consulted found nothing wrong with the earth's composition itself. Nutrients were adequate, drainage acceptable, soil quality consistent with surrounding areas. What they did notice, however, were subtle depressions in the ground, barely perceptible unless one knew to look for them, forming an almost imperceptible line stretching from the slave quarters toward the waterline, approximately 400 yards away. At first, Hayes attributed these depressions to natural settling, perhaps from heavy rains the previous winter. But his overseer, Marcus Webb, a man who had managed plantations for 15 years and prided himself on noticing details others missed, became increasingly convinced something was wrong. In his daily log from July 1829, Webb wrote, "The ground in Section D exhibits characteristics inconsistent with natural subsidence. The depressions form too regular a pattern. Moreover, I have observed that certain areas, when walked upon, produce a hollow sound distinct from surrounding terrain." Webb's suspicions intensified when he noticed behavioral changes among the field hands who worked Section D. They avoided certain areas, rerouted their paths unnecessarily, and showed what Webb described as nervous awareness when working near the slave quarters. When questioned, they attributed their behavior to superstition. One claimed the ground was unlucky. Another said he'd seen signs that the area should be avoided. But Webb was not a man who believed in superstition. He believed in observation, documentation, and methodical investigation. On the night of August 1, 1829, Webb conducted surveillance of the slave quarters from a concealed position in the tree line. His written account describes what he witnessed. "I maintained watch from approximately 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. For the first 3 hours, I observed nothing unusual. The quarters remained dark and quiet, as expected. But at approximately 1 a.m., I detected movement near the 3rd cabin, the one occupied by field hands Samuel, Benjamin, and 2 others whose names I did not know at the time. A figure emerged, carrying what appeared to be a small bucket or container. The individual moved with extreme caution, pausing frequently to observe surroundings, then disappeared behind the cabin. I waited 20 minutes, during which time nothing occurred. Then the figure reappeared, no longer carrying the container, and returned inside the cabin." Webb continued his surveillance for 3 more nights, documenting the same pattern, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always the same cabin, always the same careful, deliberate movements. On the 4th night, after the figure had disappeared behind the cabin, Webb moved from his position and approached. What he discovered would change everything. Behind the 3rd cabin, concealed beneath layers of discarded wood, dead vegetation, and what appeared to be a broken wagon wheel, was a section of floorboard that didn't quite match the surrounding planks. Webb's detailed description reveals his growing realization that he'd stumbled upon something extraordinary. The concealment was masterful. Had I not known to look precisely where the figure had disappeared, I would never have detected the irregularity. The wood appeared aged and weathered, identical to the surrounding planks in color, texture, and apparent structural integrity. But when I examined it more closely by lamplight, I discovered something remarkable. The aging was artificial. Someone had treated new wood with a solution, perhaps a mixture of ash, dirt, and oil, to create the appearance of decades-old weathering. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Webb returned to the main house and reported his findings to Hayes. The next morning, August 3rd, Hayes himself inspected the area, accompanied by Webb and two armed overseers. Hayes's personal diary from that day, discovered in his family's papers in 1923, describes his state of mind. I approached the quarters with Marcus, fully expecting to find evidence of theft, perhaps stolen tools, hidden food stores, items to be sold in town for profit. I was prepared to dispense punishment and retrieve my property. What I was not prepared for was the possibility that my property had been fundamentally altered without my knowledge, that systems and structures existed on my own land about which I knew nothing. Hayes ordered the concealed floorboard examined. When pressure was applied to a specific corner, a detail that suggested whoever had designed it understood leverage and mechanical principles, a section approximately 3 feet square released with a quiet click. The mechanism was sophisticated, wooden pegs fitted into carefully drilled holes, allowing the board to lift away cleanly while leaving no visible gaps when closed. Beneath the floorboard was darkness. Webb descended first, carrying a lantern while Hayes waited above. The overseer's account of what he found in those first moments became the foundation of the entire legal case that would follow. I expected a simple hiding space, perhaps 5 or 6 feet deep, a hole dug for concealing contraband. Instead, my lantern revealed a shaft descending much deeper than any root cellar, with walls that had been reinforced with a lattice of woven branches. The branches were not randomly placed, but formed a geometric pattern, each intersection bound with what appeared to be plant fiber. The engineering was deliberate, calculated, professional. Webb descended carefully, calling observations up to Hayes as he went. The shaft extended 12 feet down with footholds carved into the earth at regular intervals. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a horizontal passage approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough for a person to move through on hands and knees, but not to stand. The passage stretched into darkness beyond the reach of Webb's lantern. The air, contrary to what one would expect from an underground space, was surprisingly fresh. As Webb moved forward, he discovered why. Every 20 feet, small vertical shafts extended upward, breaking the surface in locations carefully chosen to avoid detection. Some emerged inside hollow stumps. Others were concealed beneath piles of field debris. One particularly clever shaft came up inside an abandoned animal burrow, making use of existing holes in the landscape. The ventilation system alone demonstrated knowledge far beyond what I would expect from field laborers, Webb wrote in his report. Each shaft was positioned to create airflow using principles of convection and pressure differential. The underground passage was cooler than the surface, causing air to flow in through certain shafts and out through others, creating circulation without mechanical intervention. But the ventilation system was only the beginning. As Webb progressed through the tunnel, he discovered that the walls had been treated with some kind of mixture that had hardened to near stone consistency. Analysis conducted years later suggested it was clay mixed with ash, animal hair, and a binding agent, possibly derived from tree sap, that created a substance remarkably resistant to water penetration and structural collapse. The tunnel descended gradually, following a gentle curve that Webb later realized had been calculated to avoid the root systems of the large oak trees that dominated Section D. Engineering analysis conducted in the 1950s, based on Webb's detailed maps and measurements, confirmed that the tunnel's path suggested awareness of soil mechanics, structural load distribution, and geotechnical engineering principles that were at that time primarily the domain of trained civil engineers. Webb's exploration revealed something else: tools. Not crude implements hastily fashioned, but carefully crafted instruments designed for specific purposes. Small shovels with blades shaped to maximize earth removal while minimizing noise. Buckets made from salvaged tin, their edges filed smooth to prevent scraping sounds. Even the handles of the tools had been wrapped with cloth to dampen sound during use. And on the tunnel walls, barely visible in the lamplight, Webb discovered markings. At first, he thought they were random scratches, perhaps made accidentally during excavation. But as he examined them more carefully, he realized they were deliberate symbols that resembled surveying notations, mathematical calculations, and what appeared to be measurements marked in increments that corresponded to feet and inches. Someone had surveyed this tunnel. Someone had planned it with precision. Someone had not simply dug a hole in the ground, but had engineered a structure designed to last. Webb reached a junction approximately 100 yards from the entrance. Here the tunnel split into 3 directions. One passage continued toward the river. Webb could smell the water, could feel the slight increase in moisture in the air. Another veered east toward the neighboring Whitfield property. The third descended even deeper, at a steeper angle than the main passage. Webb made a decision in that moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He chose to continue toward the river rather than explore the descending passage. His reasoning, as he explained later, was straightforward. If this was an escape route, it would lead to the water. Understanding where it emerged would allow Hayes to post guards and prevent future attempts. The passage to the river was complete, emerging inside a dense thicket of vegetation at the water's edge, perfectly concealed from anyone traveling by boat or walking along the opposite shore. The exit point had been chosen with remarkable strategic insight. Invisible from the plantation, accessible only by navigating through undergrowth so thick that no one would attempt it without specific reason, and positioned at a bend in the river where the current slowed enough to allow safe crossing. Webb returned to the junction and briefly examined the eastern passage, which had been abandoned mid-construction. The walls here were less finished, the supports more rudimentary. Whatever had been planned for this route had been discontinued, possibly when the builders realized it would take them too close to the Whitfield property, increasing the risk of discovery. But it was the third tunnel, the one that descended, that Webb could not bring himself to explore that day. He stood at the junction, holding his lantern, peering down into darkness that seemed to extend far beyond what his light could reach. And for the first time in his career as an overseer, Marcus Webb admitted feeling something he later described as profound unease. "I cannot explain what prevented me from descending that passage," he wrote. "I have faced violent men, dangerous animals, and severe weather without hesitation. But standing at the entrance to that descending tunnel, I felt something I had never experienced before, the absolute conviction that I should not go down there alone. It was not rational fear, not concern about structural collapse or injury. It was something else entirely, a sense that I was standing at the threshold of something I was not meant to witness." Webb returned to the surface and reported his findings to Hayes. The plantation owner's reaction was immediate and intense. Hayes ordered the entrance sealed and posted guards around the clock, but he did not call the authorities. Not yet, because Hayes needed to understand the full extent of what existed beneath his property before he decided how to respond. And that meant he would have to descend into the third passage himself. 3 days later, on August 6th, Hayes gathered his courage and entered the tunnel system, accompanied by Webb and 2 trusted overseers armed with pistols. They carried multiple lanterns, rope, and tools for marking their passage. Hayes's diary entry from that evening is remarkably detailed, suggesting he wrote it immediately after emerging, while every detail was fresh in his memory. "We descended the third passage at approximately 2 p.m., having waited until the heat of the day to ensure the tunnel would be at its driest. The descent was steep, much more so than the main passage, requiring careful footing to avoid slipping. The walls here showed the same sophisticated construction as the upper tunnels, but the craftsmanship was even more refined, as though the builders had gained experience and skill as the project progressed. The passage descended for what I estimated to be 50 feet before leveling off. At this depth, the temperature was noticeably cooler, the air carrying a mineral smell that suggested proximity to groundwater. I had expected to encounter water seepage, but the walls remained dry, another testament to whoever had designed this structure. The passage opened into a chamber. I must pause in this account, Hayes wrote, to emphasize the remarkableness of this discovery. This was not a roughly excavated hole, but a deliberately constructed room approximately 10 feet in diameter and 8 feet high, tall enough for a man to stand comfortably. The ceiling was supported by timber, salvaged from God knows where, fitted together with joints that showed understanding of load-bearing architecture. The walls had been smoothed and treated with the same hardening mixture found in the passages. But what struck Hayes most forcefully was evidence of habitation. This chamber had been occupied recently. Hayes's diary describes what he found in that underground room. Makeshift bedding consisting of multiple layers of burlap sacks stuffed with straw arranged in one corner to create a sleeping area. Containers for water, small clay vessels that appeared to have been crafted specifically for this purpose, their surfaces smooth and carefully shaped. The remains of candles made from kitchen grease mixed with plant fibers to create wicks, arranged in holders fashioned from bent metal. There were other items, too. A small wooden crate containing books, several primers for reading instruction, a Bible, and what appeared to be a journal, though I did not examine its contents at that time. Clothing neatly folded. A crude calendar scratched into the wall, marking days with tally marks that extended for what appeared to be months, possibly years. Someone had lived here, Hayes wrote. The arrangement of items suggested long-term occupation, not temporary refuge. This chamber had been someone's home, hidden beneath my plantation, existing in a space I had never imagined could exist. But the most disturbing element wasn't the evidence of habitation. It was the drawings. The chamber walls were covered with them, images scratched into the hardened surface with what must have been a sharp implement, perhaps a nail or piece of broken metal. The drawings were crude but detailed enough to be clearly recognizable. Scenes of the plantation rendered from various perspectives: the main house, the fields, the slave quarters, the river, and in every single drawing, standing at the edges of buildings or beneath trees, watching, was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, rendered with quick, desperate strokes that suggested fear in the very act of drawing. Hayes counted the drawings. There were 43 separate images covering the visible wall space, 43 scenes of plantation life. And in every single one, the watching figure was present. Who lived here? Hayes demanded of Webb and the overseers. Who created this place? But none of them had answers. The guards posted above had not reported anyone entering or leaving through the tunnel entrance since its discovery. Yet the evidence in the chamber suggested recent occupation. Some of the candles had been burned so recently that Webb could still smell the grease. Hayes made a decision in that moment. He would identify the architects of this impossible structure. He would find out who had lived in this chamber, and he would discover what the disturbing drawings meant. But even as he made these decisions, standing in that underground room lit by lantern light, surrounded by evidence of secret lives lived beneath his property, William Thornton Hayes felt the first stirrings of something he would not admit for several more days. Fear. Not fear of punishment or legal consequences. Fear of something far more primal and unsettling. Because as he stood in that chamber, examining the scratched drawings of the watching figure, Hayes began to remember things he had long suppressed. Conversations his late wife had tried to have with him, complaints she'd made about sounds in empty rooms, her growing reluctance to enter certain areas of the main house, and most disturbingly, he remembered his daughter Clara's behavior in the months before she disappeared. Her insistence that someone was watching her. Her refusal to sleep in her own bedroom. Her increasingly frantic claims that something was in the walls, moving through the house, following her from room to room. Hayes had dismissed these concerns as childish imagination. Clara had been 15, prone to dramatic declarations, susceptible to the ghost stories the house servants sometimes told. He had not taken her fears seriously. But Clara had disappeared 4 years ago, vanished one night without a trace. Her bedroom window found open. Her nightgown discovered on the riverbank 2 days later. Everyone had assumed she drowned. A tragic accident, a young girl perhaps sleepwalking, falling into the river and being swept away by the current. They had never found her body. Hayes had eventually accepted that they never would, that the river had claimed his daughter completely, that closure would come only through accepting the uncertainty. But standing in that underground chamber, looking at those desperate drawings of a tall figure that watched and waited, Hayes began to wonder if his daughter's disappearance had been something other than an accident. And he began to wonder if the person who had lived in this chamber knew more about Clara's fate than anyone had imagined possible. Hayes emerged from the tunnel system on August 6th with a single-minded determination. He would identify everyone involved in this conspiracy. He would extract the truth through whatever means necessary, and he would understand what connection, if any, existed between this underground structure and his daughter's disappearance. His first step was to order Webb to conduct a thorough inventory of plantation resources. If the tunnel builders had acquired materials, those materials had come from somewhere. Tools, timber, metal components, rope, all of these items would have been missed if taken in sufficient quantity. Webb's investigation took 3 days and produced results that only deepened the mystery. Webb's report, preserved in the court documents, details what he found. Upon careful examination of plantation stores and work equipment, I can identify no significant losses. Minor items have gone missing over the years. A broken shovel here, a damaged bucket there, but nothing in quantities sufficient to account for the materials used in tunnel construction. Either the builders acquired resources from sources beyond the plantation, or they utilized materials in ways so efficient that virtually nothing was wasted. This finding troubled Hayes more than if he'd discovered obvious theft. It suggested a level of planning and resourcefulness that seemed impossible. Someone had orchestrated this entire project with minimal resources, maximum secrecy, and extraordinary engineering skill. Hayes's next step was surveillance. He ordered Webb to quietly observe the work patterns of every enslaved person on the plantation, looking for any sign of exhaustion, unusual behavior, or suspicious interaction. For 5 days, Webb and 2 trusted overseers maintained constant observation, documenting their findings in detailed logs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas, a field hand who had worked Hayes's plantation for 12 years and was considered one of the most reliable men on the property, approached Webb privately on August 11th. Webb's account of this conversation became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the subsequent trial. Thomas appeared visibly troubled, requesting to speak with me away from other laborers. His demeanor suggested internal conflict. He was about to violate an understood code among the enslaved population by providing information to management. I assured him that if his information was valuable and truthfully provided, his cooperation would be remembered favorably. What he told me exceeded anything I had anticipated. Thomas began by admitting that he knew about the tunnel. Many of the plantation's enslaved people knew, or at least suspected, that something unusual was occurring, but they had maintained absolute silence out of loyalty to the men responsible, and out of fear of the consequences if the project was discovered prematurely. "Why are you telling me now?" Webb asked. Thomas's response was telling. "Because what started as something necessary has become something I no longer understand. Because I'm afraid of what might happen if the truth stays hidden any longer. And because I think Mr. Hayes deserves to know what happened to his daughter." This statement, according to Webb's notes, caused him to immediately summon Hayes to join the conversation. What followed was a testimony that would form the foundation of everything that came after. Thomas explained that the tunnel's architect was a man named Nathaniel Reed, purchased at the Charleston slave market 7 years prior after being sold by his previous owner in Virginia. The bill of sale, which Hayes still had in his records, described Reed as male, approximately 25 years of age, strong constitution, literate. That last designation was unusual enough to have caught Hayes's attention at the time of purchase. "I bought him because literate slaves are valuable," Hayes later testified. "They can keep basic records, assist with inventory, perform tasks that require reading instructions. I paid a premium for that education." But according to Thomas, Reed's literacy extended far beyond basic reading and writing. He could perform complex mathematical calculations in his head. He understood geometric principles and spatial relationships. He could look at a structure and identify its weaknesses, could design modifications that improved efficiency, could solve practical problems with solutions that seemed to come from formal engineering training. How is this possible? Hayes demanded. Where did he receive such education? Thomas related what Reed had told him, a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Reed's first master in Virginia had been a civil engineer who maintained an extensive personal library. The library had a window that didn't close properly. The latch had broken, and the master, elderly and forgetful, had never bothered to repair it. The window could be opened from outside with minimal effort. For 8 years, Reed had visited that library window at night. He would open it just far enough to see the pages of books by moonlight and candlelight. He began with basic texts, memorizing 1 page per night, reciting it to himself until he could reproduce it perfectly, then moving to the next page. A single book would take months to complete, but he had nothing but time and a desperate hunger for knowledge. "He told me once," Thomas said, "that education was the only form of freedom he could achieve, that no one could take knowledge away once it was acquired, that every page he memorized was territory his master could never reclaim." Over those 8 years, Reed had memorized substantial portions of engineering manuals, architectural texts, mathematics books, and practical guides to construction. He retained this information through constant mental review. building on each piece of knowledge until he had constructed an internal library that rivaled what many formally trained engineers possessed. "I don't believe it," Hayes said flatly. "Memory cannot replace practical experience. Book learning alone cannot produce what we found in those tunnels." But Thomas was prepared for this objection. He explained that Reed's second master, the one who had sold him to Hayes, had been a builder who contracted for various construction projects throughout Virginia. Reed had been assigned to work crews, where he had observed foundation excavation, structural reinforcement, and drainage systems firsthand. He had watched and learned, applying theoretical knowledge to practical situations, understanding through observation what the books could only describe. "So he can read some engineering texts and worked on construction crews," Hayes said. "That still doesn't explain the sophistication of what we discovered. That tunnel system required years of planning and flawless execution." Thomas nodded. 3 years, sir. He's been working on it for 3 years. Every night, moving one bucket of earth at a time." The timeline stunned Hayes into silence. 3 years. Over 1,000 nights of excavation performed in absolute darkness, with tools that had to be hidden each morning, with earth that had to be disposed of without leaving traces. The logistical challenge alone seemed overwhelming. The fact that it had been accomplished without detection seemed impossible. "And he didn't work alone," Thomas continued. 6 others helped him. They shared the labor, taking turns at excavation while others disposed of earth, maintained tools, and kept watch for discovery. "Who?" Hayes demanded. "Give me their names." Thomas hesitated, and Webb noted that the witness appeared conflicted, understanding that providing this information would result in severe consequences for the named individuals. But after a long pause, Thomas began listing names. Samuel, age unknown, field hand with exceptional physical strength. Benjamin, approximately 40, the plantation blacksmith who had the skills to create and maintain the specialized tools required for excavation. Joseph, mid-30s, a carpenter whose understanding of structural principles complemented Reed's theoretical knowledge. Elijah, age 23, field hand known for his reliability and discretion. Daniel, age 19, stable hand whose duties allowed him mobility across the plantation grounds. And Marcus, not to be confused with Webb, age 27, field hand who served as lookout and coordinator. Hayes ordered all 7 men brought to the main house immediately. But before the confrontation began, he had one more question for Thomas. Why did they build it? What was the purpose? Thomas's answer changed everything. They built it for Miss Clara. The statement hung in the air. Hayes, according to Webb's account, went pale. "My daughter drowned 4 years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does she have to do with this?" Thomas's response was delivered carefully, each word chosen with precision. "Sir, with respect, Miss Clara didn't drown. Mr. Reed found her by the river 3 days after she disappeared. She was alive, and he's been hiding her ever since." The confrontation between Hayes and the 7 accused men took place on August 14th in Hayes's study, witnessed by Webb, Thomas, and 2 local magistrates Hayes had summoned, Jonathan Barkley and Henry Sutton, both respected members of Charleston's legal community whose presence would lend authority to whatever confessions or denials were extracted. The court records include remarkably detailed accounts of this meeting, compiled from the written notes of all 3 officials present. The level of detail suggests they understood they were documenting something extraordinary, something that might later require precise testimony. Hayes stood behind his desk. The 7 men arranged in a line before him. Webb's description of the scene captures the tension. The accused stood with the composure of men who had long anticipated this moment. They did not appear surprised or panicked. Instead, they exhibited a kind of resigned acceptance, as though a process they had expected had finally begun. Hayes began with Reed, the identified architect of the tunnel system. "Thomas claims you found my daughter alive 4 years ago. Thomas claims you've been hiding her. Tell me the truth, or I will make the remainder of your life a daily ordeal of suffering." Reed's response, documented by Magistrate Barkley, demonstrated the education Thomas had described. "Mr. Hayes, I understand your anger and confusion. I understand that what I tell you will be difficult to accept, but I give you my word, the word of a man who has nothing left to lose, that I will speak only truth." "Then speak," Hayes commanded. What followed was a testimony that lasted over 3 hours, interrupted frequently by Hayes's questions, by demands for clarification, and by increasingly emotional responses. As the full scope of Reed's account became clear, Reed explained that on the morning of March 12, 1825, he had been sent to inspect irrigation ditches near the river, a task that required him to begin work before dawn to avoid the heat of day. As the sun rose, he heard crying, weak, intermittent, coming from the direction of the water. I knew I was taking a risk by investigating, Reed testified. A slave found wandering near the river at dawn might be suspected of attempting escape. But the crying sounded like a child in distress, and I could not ignore it. He followed the sound to a section of riverbank concealed by overgrown vegetation. There, sitting in mud and water, was Clara Hayes. She was alive, but severely disheveled. Her nightgown was torn, her feet were bloody, and her face and arms were scratched by what appeared to be thorns or branches. She was crying, but not calling for help. Instead, she was crying while repeatedly whispering, "It can't find me here. It can't cross the water. It can't cross the water." Reed's first instinct, he testified, was to run to the main house and alert Hayes immediately. But something stopped him. The look of absolute terror on Clara's face when he approached. She had recoiled from him initially, then seemed to recognize him as human rather than whatever she feared. And when he said, "Miss Clara, I need to take you home," her response had frozen him in place. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said, "If you take me back to that house, it will kill me. I barely got away. Please don't make me go back." Reed knew he was in an impossible situation. A slave found with the master's daughter, particularly one in Clara's condition, would face immediate execution. The assumption of assault or abduction would be automatic, and no testimony would save him. But leaving her by the river meant she might die of exposure or drown, or be found by someone else who would then hunt Reed down as the most obvious suspect. So he made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. He chose to hide her. There was an old equipment shed near Section D, Reed explained. It had been damaged in a storm years before and never repaired, eventually becoming overgrown with vegetation. No one had entered it in years. I brought Miss Clara there, Reed testified. Gave her my own blanket, found food from my rations, and told her to stay absolutely silent while I determined what to do next. Hayes interrupted here, his voice shaking. "Why didn't you simply tell me the truth? Why didn't you explain that you'd found her?" Reed's answer was delivered with quiet conviction. "Sir, because she begged me not to. Because every time I suggested bringing her back, she became so distressed that I feared she would hurt herself trying to run. And because she told me things about your house that I had heard whispered among the quarters, things I had half believed might be true." "What things?" Magistrate Sutton demanded. Reed hesitated, glancing at his 6 companions, before answering. "She said something lived in the house, something that had been watching her for months, something that moved through walls and waited in corners. She said it had come for her that night, had entered her locked bedroom somehow, and she had fled through the window and run to the river because she remembered her mother once telling her that certain things cannot cross running water." The study fell silent. Hayes's face had gone from red with anger to pale. Webb noted in his report that Mr. Hayes gripped the edge of his desk as though requiring physical support. "My daughter was suffering from fever delusions," Hayes finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She was ill and confused." "Sir," Reed responded carefully, "she had no fever. I checked daily. Her mind was clear in every respect, except this one conviction that something in your house meant to harm her." Reed continued his testimony, explaining the impossible calculation he'd faced. Clara was alive, but traumatized and adamant about not returning. Reed could not reveal her location without implicating himself, and he could not simply leave her to die. So he began forming a plan that seemed, even to him, almost impossible. He would build a secure hiding place where Clara could live safely, until she either recovered enough to return on her own terms, or until circumstances changed in some way that allowed the truth to emerge safely. "I had knowledge of engineering and construction," Reed testified. "I had been thinking for years about methods of creating hidden spaces, concealed routes, structures that could exist without detection. I had never imagined I would apply this knowledge in such circumstances, but I had the theoretical framework to attempt it." Reed spent 3 days planning the tunnel system. He selected the location behind the third cabin carefully. It was positioned in a way that traffic around it was minimal, the ground was suitable for excavation, and the route to the river avoided major obstacles. He calculated the depth required for structural stability, the reinforcement necessary to prevent collapse, the ventilation needed for breathability, and the drainage required to keep the passages dry. Then he approached 6 men he trusted, explaining only that he needed their help building a secure hiding place for someone who desperately needed sanctuary. He did not reveal Clara's identity, telling them only that a person's life depended on absolute secrecy. Why did they agree? Hayes demanded. Reed's answer was simple. Because all of us understood what it meant to need sanctuary. Because we trusted each other. And because I offered them something valuable. I offered to teach them everything I knew about engineering, mathematics, and construction while we worked. Education in exchange for labor and loyalty. The 7 men had begun excavating on May 1st, 1825, working only between midnight and 3 a.m., the hours when exhaustion kept most people deeply asleep. They removed approximately 1 bucket of earth per night. The earth was distributed throughout the quarters, mixed into floor dirt where it would never be noticed, or added to garden plots to improve soil depth, deposited in the river during high water when sediment would mask the addition. They removed approximately 30 pounds of earth per night on average, a quantity that could be carried in small containers hidden in clothing or transported during legitimate work movements. The excavation proceeded slowly but steadily. By the end of the first year, they had completed the main shaft and the initial 50 feet of horizontal passage. By the end of the second year, the tunnel reached the river and the underground chamber had been excavated. The third year was devoted to refinement, improving ventilation, strengthening walls, creating the concealment mechanisms that made the entrance nearly impossible to detect. Throughout this process, Clara had remained hidden, first in the abandoned shed, then in the partially completed tunnel, and finally in the finished chamber. Reed visited her daily, bringing food he saved from his own rations, water, candles, and eventually books he managed to acquire through carefully maintained connections with slaves from other plantations who worked in Charleston and had limited access to materials. What was her condition during these years? Magistrate Barkley asked. Reed's response revealed the complexity of what he'd witnessed. She improved in some ways. She learned to trust me completely. She ate regularly, maintained basic hygiene, even began reading extensively. She went through every book I could provide multiple times. But her fundamental conviction never wavered. She remained absolutely certain that something malevolent existed in the main house, and she refused to consider returning there. Hayes could no longer contain himself. This is insanity. You're telling me my daughter has been living in a hole in the ground for 4 years because of childish fears and superstitions? Reed's answer was quiet but firm. Sir, I'm telling you that your daughter made a choice. She chose life and hiding over whatever she believed awaited her in that house. And I helped her because I believed then, and believe now, that her fear was real. Perhaps not in the way she perceived it, but real nonetheless. The testimony continued with Reed providing extensive detail about the tunnel's construction, the daily routine of caring for Clara, and the elaborate systems of secrecy that had kept the entire operation hidden for 3 years. But one question remained unanswered, and Magistrate Sutton finally voiced it. Mr. Reed, Thomas mentioned something to Mr. Hayes about an 8th person. Evidence found in the chamber suggests someone else may have used the space. Can you explain this? For the first time during his testimony, Reed appeared uncertain. He glanced at his 6 companions again, and some unspoken communication seemed to pass between them. Finally, he spoke. There were times, not many, perhaps a dozen occasions over 4 years, when I would arrive at the chamber and find that items had been moved, candles extinguished and relit, books opened to different pages than where Clara had left them, and Clara herself would be agitated. She would say it had visited, that it had found the chamber, had stood in the corner watching her, but couldn't fully enter because the earth somehow prevented it from manifesting completely. Did you ever see this figure yourself? Sutton pressed. Reed's answer would become one of the most debated elements of the entire case. Not in the chamber, sir, but in the tunnels, yes. 3 times I saw something that I cannot adequately explain. A shadow that seemed wrong, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that didn't correspond to any light source. I told myself it was fatigue, Tricks of lamplight, paranoia. But I saw it. And each time I felt an overwhelming urge to leave the tunnel immediately. The study fell silent again. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice barely controlled. "Where is my daughter now?" Reed's answer was immediate. "In the chamber, sir, where she's been safe for 4 years. Waiting." Waiting for what? Reed met Hayes's eyes directly. "For you to believe her, sir. For someone to acknowledge that what she experienced was real, or at least real to her. For someone to make the house safe, or to burn it down, or to do whatever is necessary so she can live in sunlight again." Hayes, accompanied by Webb, the 2 magistrates, Thomas, and all 7 accused men, descended into the tunnel system on August 15, 1829 at approximately 2 p.m. The expedition was documented in extraordinary detail by Magistrate Barkley, whose written account provides a minute-by-minute description of what they found. The group carried multiple lanterns, and Reed led the way, moving through the passages with the confidence of someone who had traversed them countless times. Barkley noted that the tunnel system's sophistication became more apparent with direct experience. The engineering was not merely adequate, but exceptional, demonstrating principles of structural integrity that would be remarkable even in works constructed by trained professionals with proper resources. As they descended toward the chamber, Reed called ahead, announcing their presence so Clara would not be frightened. "It's Nathaniel, Miss Clara. I've brought your father. He knows you're alive. It's safe now. You can come out." The silence that followed seemed to stretch impossibly long. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice, weak, uncertain, but distinctly female. "Father, is father really there?" Hayes, according to all witnesses, broke down immediately. He pushed past Reed, stumbling into the chamber, holding his lantern high. And there, pressed against the far wall as far from the entrance as the space allowed, was Clara Hayes. Barkley's description is both detailed and heartbreaking. The young woman appeared to be in adequate physical health. No signs of malnourishment or disease. But her demeanor was that of someone who had lived in constant fear. Her hair, once presumably kept in the style of young ladies of her class, was cut short and practical. Her clothing was simple, a plain dress that appeared to have been made from repurposed fabric. Most striking were her eyes, which held an intensity that suggested either profound wisdom or profound disturbance, perhaps both. Hayes approached his daughter, arms outstretched, calling her name. Clara watched him come, not moving, not responding, her expression difficult to read in the lamplight. When Hayes reached her, she allowed herself to be embraced, but she did not return the embrace. She simply stood passive as her father wept and repeated her name. "Clara, we thought you were dead. We searched for you. We mourned you. Why didn't you come home?" Clara's response, documented by all 3 written accounts of the scene, was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. "Because home isn't safe. It's been in the house for years. Long before I was born, probably. It lives in the spaces between rooms. It watches through walls. It tried to take me that night, and I barely escaped. This place is safe because it's buried in earth. The thing can't fully cross into earth. But up there in the house, it's always present." Hayes pulled back to look at his daughter's face. "Clara, there's nothing in the house. You were ill. You were confused. Do you remember?" Clara interrupted, her voice still flat. "Do you remember how Mother refused to sleep in your bedroom? How she had the servants move her to the guest room, then to the small room on the first floor, then finally to the drawing room couch, because she said she couldn't find a space in the house where she felt alone." Hayes's face showed recognition and pain. Magistrate Sutton noted. Mr. Hayes appeared stricken by his daughter's words, suggesting they resonated with memories he had perhaps suppressed or dismissed. Clara continued. "Mother knew something was wrong. She tried to tell you, but you thought she was being hysterical. And when I tried to tell you that something was watching me, following me from room to room, you said I was imagining things. But Mother believed me. The week before she died, she told me, 'Clara, if it ever comes for you directly, run to water. Some things can't cross running water.' I thought she was delirious with fever, but when it came into my locked room that night, when I saw it standing at the foot of my bed, I remembered, and I ran." The magistrates exchanged glances. This testimony was far beyond what they had expected to document. Barkley wrote later, in a private letter discovered years after his death, I found myself in a situation that defied my legal training and experience. Here was a young woman, clearly intelligent and articulate, describing events that reason told me could not be real. Yet her conviction was absolute, and I observed that her father's denials seemed increasingly hollow, as though he were arguing against something he partially believed himself. Hayes attempted to convince Clara to return to the surface, promising that he would ensure her safety, that he would believe her claims, that they would address whatever concerned her about the main house. But Clara refused, becoming increasingly agitated as he pressed. "I won't go back there," she said, her voice rising. "I won't. I'd rather die here than set foot in that house again." Nathaniel Reed, who had been standing quietly at the chamber entrance, spoke. "Sir, perhaps forcing her is not the answer. Perhaps we should allow her to come to terms with this gradually." But Hayes, overwhelmed by emotion and confusion, made a decision he would later regret. He ordered Webb and the two overseers who had accompanied them to physically escort Clara from the chamber. What followed, according to all witnesses, was deeply disturbing. Clara fought with surprising strength, screaming that they were condemning her to death, that the thing would be waiting, that they didn't understand what they were doing. She had to be carried through the tunnel passages, and when they finally emerged at the surface, her distress intensified. "It can see me now," she kept repeating. "It knows I'm out. It's watching from the house. It's waiting." Hayes arranged for Clara to be taken to the main house and confined to a secure bedroom, not her old room, as she became hysterical at that suggestion, but a guest room on the first floor. A physician was summoned from Charleston, Dr. Edmund Morris, whose detailed medical notes would later become part of the court record. Dr. Morris's initial examination, conducted on the evening of August 15th, found Clara to be physically healthy, but psychologically disturbed. His notes describe her as highly intelligent, articulate, and capable of coherent conversation on most topics, but fixated on the belief that a malevolent entity inhabits the Hayes residence. He prescribed rest, regular meals, and gentle encouragement to reacclimate to normal life. But that first night back in the main house proved disastrous. Clara did not sleep. According to the housemaid assigned to watch over her, Clara sat in the corner of the room as far from the door and windows as possible, watching the walls as though expecting something to emerge from them. She refused to eat. She spoke only to say repeatedly, "It knows I'm here now. It's coming." By morning, Clara had scratched marks on the wall beside her, the same type of marks found in the underground chamber, drawings of the plantation, and in every drawing, the same tall, thin figure watching. Hayes, confronted with his daughter's condition and increasingly unable to dismiss her claims, made a decision that would lead directly to the legal proceedings that followed. He would file charges against the 7 men who had built the tunnel, partly out of genuine belief that they should face consequences for their actions, but primarily, as he later admitted, as a way of forcing an official investigation that might provide answers he couldn't find on his own. On August 16th, Hayes formally charged Nathaniel Reed, Samuel, Benjamin, Joseph, Elijah, Daniel, and Marcus with conspiracy, property damage, theft, and unlawful confinement. The Charleston District Court accepted the case, and a trial date was set for August 20th. But before the trial could begin, something happened that changed the entire nature of the case. On the night of August 17th, Clara Hayes disappeared again. She had been confined to the guest room under watch, but the housemaid assigned to monitor her fell asleep around 2 a.m. When she woke at dawn, Clara was gone. The door was still locked from the outside. The key had been in the maid's possession the entire time. The window was closed and latched from the inside. Yet Clara had vanished. A frantic search of the property revealed nothing. But Webb, thinking logically, went to the tunnel entrance. It had been sealed after Clara's removal, but when Webb examined it, he found that someone had reopened it from inside. The concealment mechanism had been operated correctly, suggesting whoever had opened it knew exactly how it functioned. Webb descended into the tunnel and made his way to the underground chamber. There he found Clara, returned to her sanctuary. She was calm, no longer hysterical, and she was drawing on the walls again. Webb's report describes the conversation. "I asked Miss Clara how she had escaped a locked room with the key held by someone outside. She responded, the same way it gets through locked doors. I went through the walls. I don't know how. I just knew that I had to get back underground before it found me completely exposed. I believe she was speaking metaphorically or describing a mental state rather than a physical action, but her conviction was absolute. Webb convinced Clara to return to the surface one more time, promising that she would be taken to Charleston, away from the plantation entirely, and placed in professional care where she would feel safe. Clara agreed, only when Webb assured her that Nathaniel Reed would be allowed to visit her, that the one person who had believed her would not be taken away. This time, Clara was transported directly to Dr. Morris's private facility in Charleston, where she would remain under observation throughout the trial and for years afterward. Her testimony would be documented there, providing some of the most disturbing evidence presented to the court. The Charleston District Court on August 20th, 1829, was filled beyond capacity. Word of the case had spread throughout the city's property-owning class, creating a mixture of fascination and fear. If 7 enslaved men could construct something this sophisticated without detection, what else might be happening on plantations throughout the region? What other structures existed in secret? What other conspiracies remained undiscovered? Judge Samuel Winters, a man of 58 with a reputation for stern but fair rulings, presided. He had reviewed the preliminary documentation and understood he was facing a case unlike any he had previously encountered. His opening remarks, preserved in the trial transcript, acknowledged this explicitly. This court has been asked to adjudicate a matter that presents both legal violations and circumstances of such unusual character that they challenge conventional judicial analysis. 7 men stand accused of crimes that are clearly documented, but the context within which those crimes occurred raises questions about motivation, necessity, and moral duty that cannot be easily dismissed. This court will seek truth above all else, and will render judgment based on law while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the facts we must examine. The prosecutor, Charles Whitfield, a young attorney eager to make his reputation, had prepared a case he believed would be straightforward. His opening statement laid out the charges clearly. The 7 defendants had damaged Hayes's property by excavating an extensive tunnel system. They had stolen materials and resources to construct said tunnels. They had conspired over a period of 3 years to facilitate what could only be interpreted as preparation for escape. And most seriously, they had hidden a missing person, allowing Hayes to believe his daughter was dead when they knew she was alive. The facts are not in dispute, Whitfield declared. The defendants admit to all these actions. The only question before this court is whether any justification exists for crimes that, under normal circumstances, would merit the harshest possible punishment. The defense counsel, appointed by the court due to the unusual nature of the case, was Martin Caldwell, an older attorney with experience in complex property cases but no background in criminal defense involving enslaved persons. His opening statement acknowledged the challenges he faced. "Your Honor, I do not dispute the facts as presented by the prosecution. My clients did indeed commit the acts described, but I will present evidence that their actions, while technically illegal, were motivated by an imperative that transcends conventional legal categories, the preservation of a life that would otherwise have been lost. This case asks us to consider whether law should mechanically punish actions that, while violating statute, upheld a higher moral principle." The trial would last 4 days, producing over 300 pages of testimony and documentation. What follows is a summary of the key testimonies, all preserved in the official court record. Day 1. Establishing the facts. Hayes testified first, describing the tunnel's discovery, the investigation, and his eventual confrontation with Reed and the other defendants. His testimony was factual and measured, though court reporters noted that he became emotional when discussing Clara's disappearance and subsequent discovery. Cross-examination by Caldwell focused on a crucial question. "Mr. Hayes, had Mr. Reed brought your daughter back to you immediately upon finding her in the condition you now know she was in, what would have been the likely consequence for Mr. Reed?" Hayes hesitated before answering honestly. "I would have assumed he had harmed her. The circumstances, finding a slave with my daughter in such a state, would have led to only one conclusion, and the punishment for that assumed crime. Death," Hayes admitted quietly. "Immediate execution, most likely." This exchange established a key element of the defense. Reed had faced a situation where the legally correct action, returning Clara immediately, would have resulted in his death, while the illegal action, hiding her, preserved both her life and his own. Webb testified next, providing detailed technical analysis of the tunnel system. His testimony included measurements, structural assessments, and engineering evaluations. Several trained engineers in the gallery, called upon to comment, confirmed that the construction demonstrated advanced knowledge that seemed incompatible with Reed's background and available resources. "How do you explain this discrepancy?" Whitfield asked. Webb's answer was honest. "I cannot, sir. Unless Mr. Reed is a mathematical prodigy capable of teaching himself through observation and memorization, which seems improbable but not impossible, there is no explanation that satisfies my understanding of how such knowledge is typically acquired." The afternoon of day 1 was devoted to testimony from the 6 accomplices: Samuel, Benjamin, Joseph, Elijah, Daniel, and Marcus. Each was questioned about his role in the construction, his knowledge of the project's purpose, and his awareness that what he was doing violated plantation rules and possibly law. Their testimonies were consistent. Reed had approached each of them individually, explained that someone's life depended on building a secure hiding place, emphasized the need for absolute secrecy, and offered to teach them valuable skills in exchange for their labor and loyalty. None of them had known they were hiding Clara Hayes specifically. Reed had concealed her identity to protect both her and them. "Why did you agree to participate?" Caldwell asked each man. The answers varied in wording but were consistent in meaning. Samuel: "Because I trusted Nathaniel, and because I understood what it meant to need a place where you could be safe." Benjamin: "Because building something that could protect someone felt more valuable than anything else I'd done in my life." Joseph: "Because Nathaniel taught me to read while we worked, and that gift was worth any risk." These testimonies created sympathy in the courtroom, particularly among the few spectators who harbored anti-slavery sentiments. But they did not change the legal facts. The men had committed crimes, and the law demanded consequences. Day 2, Nathaniel Reed's testimony. Reed took the witness stand on the morning of August 21st. His testimony would last nearly 6 hours, interrupted frequently by questions from both Whitfield and Caldwell, and occasionally by Judge Winters himself. Reed's account began with his early life in Virginia, his first master's library, and his years of secret education through the broken window. He described the process in detail, selecting books, memorizing pages, reciting them endlessly to ensure retention, building a mental library over 8 years of nocturnal study. "Why go to such extraordinary lengths?" Judge Winters asked. "What did you hope to gain?" Reed's answer became one of the most quoted passages from the trial. "Your Honor, I was born into a system that denied my humanity. I could not change my legal status, could not earn my freedom through any means available to me. But I could prove to myself that I possessed a mind equal to any free man's. Every page I memorized was evidence of my humanity. Every principle I mastered was territory that slavery could not touch. Knowledge became my resistance." The courtroom fell silent. Winters nodded slowly, then gestured for Reed to continue. Reed described his second master's construction business, his observation of building techniques, and his eventual sale to Hayes. He explained his 7 years on the Hayes plantation, his observation of the property, and his growing awareness that something was profoundly wrong in the main house. "What do you mean by wrong?" Whitfield demanded. Reed's answer was careful. "I mean, sir, that those of us who worked in or near the main house all felt something oppressive about the atmosphere. Doors that should have been closed would be found open. Items would be moved without explanation. And sounds, footsteps in empty rooms, scratching in walls, voices when no one was present. The house servants spoke of it constantly, though never in the hearing of white overseers." Whitfield scoffed. "You're asking this court to give credence to slave superstitions." But Reed's response was firm. "I'm asking this court to acknowledge that multiple people over many years experience phenomena they could not explain. Whether those experiences resulted from actual anomalous occurrences or from shared psychological response to a place where suffering had occurred regularly, I cannot say. But the experiences were real to those who had them." Reed then described the morning he found Clara by the river, her condition, her terror, and her desperate plea not to be returned to the house. He explained his impossible choice and his decision to hide her while he determined a solution. "At what point did you decide to build the tunnel system?" Caldwell asked. Reed's answer revealed the depth of his planning. Within 3 days, sir. I realized Clara would not recover quickly, if at all. I realized that hiding her temporarily was inadequate. I needed a permanent solution, or at least something that could last indefinitely. And I realized that the only way to create such a solution was to build something no one could discover accidentally. Something underground, structurally sound, properly ventilated, and completely hidden. He described the planning process. 3 weeks of calculations, drawings made in dirt and then erased, mental simulations of construction sequences, identification of challenges and solutions. Only when he was confident the project was feasible did he approach potential collaborators. The testimony turned to the construction itself, and Reed provided technical details that impressed even the skeptical engineers in the gallery. He explained soil load calculations, water table considerations, air pressure management, and structural reinforcement principles, all delivered with the precision of someone who had deeply internalized engineering fundamentals. "Where did you dispose of the excavated earth?" Whitfield asked, attempting to identify some flaw in the operation. Reed's answer demonstrated the thoroughness of his planning. "We removed approximately 3,000 cubic feet of earth over 3 years. That volume was distributed across the entire plantation in ways that would never be noticed. Mixed into the floors of slave quarters, added to garden plots, spread in areas where fill was needed, deposited in the river during high water when sediment would mask the addition. We removed approximately 30 pounds of earth per night on average, a quantity that could be carried in small containers hidden in clothing or transported during legitimate work movements." The testimony continued through the afternoon, covering Clara's years in hiding, Reed's daily visits to provide food and support, and the peculiar occurrences Clara reported, the sense of being watched, the occasional presence of something she couldn't fully describe, the drawings she made obsessively as a way of externalizing her fear. Finally, Whitfield asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Mr. Reed, do you actually believe something supernatural existed in the Hayes house? Or were you simply indulging a young woman's delusions to justify your own criminal actions?" Reed's answer was thoughtful and measured. "Sir, I believe Clara experienced something that terrified her deeply. Whether that something was a literal presence, a psychological manifestation of trauma, or something between those categories, I cannot say with certainty. But I can say this, I felt it too. Not as strongly as Clara, but I felt it. And more importantly, I believed her fear was real enough that returning her to the source of that fear would have destroyed her. So yes, I built her a sanctuary, and I would do it again." Day 3. Clara's testimony and medical evidence. Clara Hayes did not testify in person. Her fragile psychological state made courtroom appearance inadvisable. Instead, Dr. Edmund Morris presented his detailed medical notes, based on extensive interviews conducted at his Charleston facility. Morris's testimony provided the most disturbing material of the entire trial. He described Clara as highly intelligent, articulate, well-read, and capable of sophisticated reasoning on all topics except one, the nature of what she experienced in the Hayes main house. Morris had spent hours interviewing Clara about her experiences, documenting everything she reported with clinical precision. His notes, read into the court record, described Clara's account of the years leading up to her disappearance. The patient reports that she first became aware of an unusual presence in the house around age 12. She described sensing that she was being watched in certain rooms, particularly her bedroom, the hallway outside her bedroom, and the second-floor library. Initially, she attributed this feeling to imagination or the normal unease children experience in old houses. However, over the following 3 years, the sense of being watched intensified. She began seeing movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that didn't correspond to any light source, shapes that seemed wrong in ways she struggled to articulate. She reported these experiences to her mother, who the patient claims acknowledged having similar experiences and expressed concern. The patient states that her mother, Mrs. Caroline Hayes, became increasingly fearful during the final year of her life. Mrs. Hayes allegedly refused to sleep in certain rooms, had servants conduct religious ceremonies in various parts of the house, and told the patient that something malevolent had taken root in the residence over many years. The patient reports that on the night of March 9, 1825, she woke to find what she describes as a tall, impossibly thin figure standing at the foot of her bed. She states that the figure did not move, but simply watched her. Paralyzed by fear, the patient lay still for what she estimates was several minutes. Then the figure began to approach. According to the patient, she forced herself to move, jumping from bed and running to her bedroom door. The door was locked. She had locked it herself before sleeping. But when she turned the key, the lock did not release. She describes hearing scratching sounds from the hallway, as though something was trying to enter. In desperation, the patient went to her window, opened it, and climbed onto the porch roof. She states that she could feel the presence following her, could sense its intent to prevent her escape. Remembering her mother's advice about running water, she fled toward the river. The patient reports falling multiple times, injuring her feet and tearing her nightgown on branches and thorns. She reached the river and entered the water, wading in up to her chest before the cold forced her back to shore. She spent the night hidden in riverside vegetation, finally falling asleep from exhaustion as dawn approached. This is when Mr. Reed discovered her. Morris's testimony continued, describing Clara's years in hiding and her current condition. The patient remains convinced that the entity she encountered has not been destroyed or driven away. She insists it remains in the Hayes house, waiting for her to return. She has drawn hundreds of images of this entity, always depicting it as tall, thin, and positioned at the edges of scenes, observing. Most significantly, the patient demonstrates no other signs of mental illness. Her memory is excellent. Her reasoning is sound. Her emotional range is appropriate, except when discussing this specific topic. She reads voraciously, engages in intelligent conversation, and shows no confusion or disorientation about any other aspect of reality. This presents a clinical puzzle. How can a patient be completely rational in all respects except one highly specific delusion? Current medical understanding suggests that delusions typically present as part of broader mental deterioration, not as isolated convictions existing alongside otherwise healthy cognitive function. Whitfield attempted to use this testimony to argue that Clara was simply mentally ill, and that Reed had enabled her illness rather than helping her. But Caldwell's cross-examination focused on a different question. Dr. Morris, in your professional opinion, if Clara Hayes had been forcibly returned to the main house on the day Mr. Reed found her and confined there despite her terror, what would have been the likely outcome? Morris's answer was sobering. Based on my observations of the patient's psychological state, I believe forced confinement in the location she feared would have resulted in complete mental collapse, possibly accompanied by self-harm or suicide attempt. Mr. Reed's decision to hide her, while legally questionable, may well have preserved her sanity and possibly her life. The afternoon of Day 3 featured testimony from house servants who had worked in the Hayes main house over the years. Their accounts, delivered nervously under oath, revealed a pattern of unusual occurrences that multiple people had experienced. That a housemaid named Ruth described objects moving without explanation. I would place items in one location and return to find them moved. At first, I thought I was forgetting where I'd put things, but then I began marking locations with small chalk marks, and I knew for certain items were being moved. A cook named Elizabeth reported sounds in the walls. At night, after everyone had retired, I would hear scratching and movement inside the walls. Not like rats or mice. The sounds were too regular, too patterned, like footsteps, but impossibly located. A stable hand named Peter, whose duty sometimes took him into the main house, described an experience in the second-floor hallway. I was delivering firewood one evening when I saw something at the end of the hallway. It was tall, thin, standing absolutely still. I thought it was a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too narrow. I called out, asking who was there. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. I approached carefully, and as I got closer, it simply wasn't there anymore. Not like it had left, like it had never been there at all. These testimonies created significant discomfort in the courtroom. Multiple spectators departed early. Even Judge Winters appeared troubled, calling for a recess after Peter's account and spending the break in his chambers rather than in the courtroom, as was his custom. Day 4, Closing Arguments and Verdict. The final day of the trial began with closing arguments. Whitfield's statement was brief and focused on legal principle. Your Honor, this case presents sympathetic circumstances, but sympathy cannot override law. The defendants committed crimes they admit, crimes that are thoroughly documented. If we excuse these actions because of their emotional context, we establish precedent that enslaved persons can decide for themselves when law applies to them. This court cannot permit such precedent without undermining the entire legal structure of our society. I ask that the court find the defendants guilty as charged and impose sentences that reflect the seriousness of their violations, tempered by acknowledgement of their motivations. Caldwell's closing argument was longer and more passionate. Your Honor, I submit that this case demonstrates the inadequacy of law when confronted with genuine moral complexity. The law says these men committed crimes. But a higher law, the law of human compassion, of moral duty, of recognizing shared humanity, says they did something profoundly right. Nathaniel Reed found a young woman who would have died without intervention. He faced a choice: obey law and condemn her to death while ensuring his own execution, or violate law and preserve both lives. He chose life. His 6 companions helped him maintain that choice for 4 years, demonstrating loyalty, skill, and courage. This court has the power to punish them. But I ask, should it? Does justice truly demand that we punish men who, despite every disadvantage, every denial of education and opportunity, every circumstance working against them, manage to perform an engineering miracle motivated purely by the desire to preserve life? I ask this court to consider that these men embody values our society claims to cherish: ingenuity, determination, courage, and compassion. Punishing them sends a message that these values mean nothing when exercised by those whom our legal system has deemed property rather than persons. Find them guilty if you must. The facts admit no other conclusion. But in sentencing, I beg this court to demonstrate that justice can recognize righteousness, even when it violates statute. Judge Winters took 3 hours to deliberate. When he returned to deliver his verdict, the courtroom was silent enough that his breathing was audible. I have reviewed the evidence, considered the testimony, and examined the applicable law. Winters began. The facts are not in dispute. The defendants committed the acts with which they are charged. By any strict reading of law, they are guilty. Therefore, this court finds all 7 defendants guilty on all charges. However, he paused, and the tension in the courtroom intensified. However, this court also finds that the circumstances surrounding these crimes are so extraordinary that they demand extraordinary consideration in sentencing. The defendants did not act from malice, greed, or selfish interest. They acted to preserve a life that would otherwise have been lost. They demonstrated skills, intelligence, and moral courage that would be remarkable in any person of any station. Moreover, this court acknowledges a troubling truth. Had Mr. Reed acted in strict accordance with law, 2 people would likely be dead today: Miss Clara Hayes, from exposure or despair, and Mr. Reed himself, from execution based on incorrect assumptions about his role in her condition. The law is not designed to produce such outcomes. When rigid application of law leads to death, while violation of law preserves life, we must ask ourselves which serves justice. Therefore, while this court must render guilty verdicts, it will impose the following sentence: the 7 defendants will be sold out of state, with proceeds to compensate Mr. Hayes for documented losses and damages. However, another pause, longer this time. However, Mr. Hayes has informed this court that he wishes to purchase the defendants' freedom rather than sell them to other masters. He has agreed to manumit all 7 men, paying all associated fees and costs, and to provide each with $50 and safe passage to Philadelphia or another city of their choosing where they may establish free lives. Additionally, Mr. Hayes has agreed that the defendants will be granted 1 week to prepare for departure, during which time they will be permitted to visit Miss Clara Hayes at Dr. Morris's facility, as she has requested. This court accepts Mr. Hayes's offer and orders it implemented immediately. The defendants are hereby manumitted and granted freedom, with the understanding that they must leave South Carolina within 2 weeks and are forbidden to return under penalty of re-enslavement. This court further orders that all details of this case be sealed for a period of 10 years, to protect Miss Clara Hayes's privacy and to prevent misuse of the unusual circumstances as precedent in future cases. This concludes the matter. The week between the verdict and the 7 men's departure from South Carolina provides some of the most poignant documentation in the entire case. Letters, diary entries, and reports from various observers capture a brief moment when impossible circumstances created unexpected connections between people whom society had designated as fundamentally separate. Hayes, shaken by his daughter's condition and forced to confront his own failures as a father, spent hours in conversation with Reed. Webb's notes from this period, discovered decades later in his personal papers, described these exchanges as remarkable for their honesty and mutual respect, transcending the social positions that technically still defined their relationship until the Freedom Papers were officially registered. Hayes wanted to understand everything Reed had observed about Clara during the 4 years of her hiding. Reed obliged, describing daily routines, conversations, Clara's reading habits, her fears, and her remarkable resilience. She never gave up, Reed told Hayes. She never accepted that her life was over or that she would spend the rest of her existence hidden from sunlight. She always believed that eventually someone would listen, someone would believe her, and she would find a way to live normally again. Hayes asked the question that had been haunting him. Do you believe what she says about the house? Do you truly think something evil exists there? Reed's answer, preserved in Hayes's diary, was carefully considered. Mr. Hayes, I believe Clara experienced something that caused her genuine terror. Whether that something was a literal presence, a psychological manifestation of trauma, or something between those categories, I cannot say with certainty. But I can tell you this. I felt something too. Many of us did. And I believe that places can become poisoned by what occurs within them. That suffering and cruelty and death can leave marks that persist long after the events themselves have ended. This conversation led Hayes to make a decision that shocked everyone who knew about it. On August 27th, one day before Reed and his companions were scheduled to depart for Philadelphia, Hayes had the main house burned to the ground. The official reason given was termite damage and structural concerns, but Webb's private notes reveal the truth. Mr. Hayes ordered me to evacuate all salvageable items, remove all family papers and valuables, and then burn the structure completely. When I asked why, he said simply, because my daughter begged me to, because my wife died asking me to, and because I should have listened to them years ago. The fire was set at dawn on August 27th. The entire structure burned throughout the day, and Hayes stood watching until nothing remained but charred timbers and ash. Several observers reported that Hayes seemed relieved, as though an enormous burden had been lifted. Later that same day, all 7 freed men visited Clara at Dr. Morris's facility. The meeting was documented by Morris, who observed from a respectful distance. His notes described Clara's joy at seeing Reed, her thanks to the other 6 men whose names she had learned only recently, and her relief at learning the house had been destroyed. It's gone? She asked Reed repeatedly. You're certain it's gone completely? Reed assured her. Your father burned it himself. Nothing remains. Clara wept, then laughed, then wept again. The first genuine emotional expression Morris had observed from her since she'd been brought to his facility. Then maybe I can try, she said. Maybe I can try to live again. Reed's farewell to Clara, as described by Morris, was deeply moving. Miss Clara, you are the bravest person I have ever known. You survived 4 years in darkness because you refused to return to something that terrified you. That took a strength I'm not sure I possess. You're going to recover from this. You're going to have a full life, and I'll think of you often wherever I am. And I'll be proud to have known you. Clara gave Reed a small package, a collection of drawings she'd made over the years. Not the disturbing images of the watching figure, but rather sketches of flowers, landscapes, imagined scenes of freedom. So you remember that I wasn't only afraid, she said. So you remember that I could still imagine beauty. Reed accepted the package with a promise to keep it always. On August 28th, the 7 men left Charleston, traveling by wagon to Philadelphia. They carried their freedom papers, $50 each, and letters of introduction Hayes had written to abolition societies in Pennsylvania. The letters described the men as individuals of exceptional character and remarkable capability, whose freedom I have secured with pride and satisfaction. The group would remain together in Philadelphia for approximately 6 months before gradually dispersing to different cities as opportunities arose. But they maintained contact throughout their lives, meeting when possible and corresponding regularly, supporting each other through the challenges of building free lives in a nation still largely hostile to their freedom. Clara Hayes remained under Dr. Morris's care for 18 months following the trial. The medical records from this period, preserved in the Charleston Medical Society archives, document her gradual recovery and provide insight into the long-term effects of her experience. Initially, Clara struggled with anxiety whenever she left the facility. Open spaces made her uncomfortable. She had spent 4 years in an underground chamber and found the sky oppressive. But Morris employed what he called graduated exposure, allowing Clara to spend increasing amounts of time outdoors under supervised conditions. By December 1829, Clara was able to walk in the facility's gardens without distress. By March 1830, she could visit Charleston's Market District with a chaperone. By July 1830, she was ready to attempt living independently, though she would never return to the plantation property. Hayes sold the plantation in early 1831 to a family from Virginia who knew nothing of its history. He purchased a townhouse in Charleston where Clara could live under his care, with servants she trusted and no connection to the location of her trauma. Clara's recovery was remarkable but incomplete. She never entirely lost the belief that something had hunted her in the main house, though she learned to discuss it in ways that didn't alarm those around her. Morris's notes indicate that he came to view her belief not as delusion, but as a conviction so deeply embedded that it forms part of her fundamental understanding of the world, neither wholly rational nor wholly irrational, but rather a truth that exists in a space between those categories. Clara never married, though she received several proposals over the years. She told Morris that she couldn't ask someone to share a life with a person who carried such strange experiences. Instead, she devoted herself to education, establishing a small school for girls in Charleston, where she taught literature and art until her death in 1847. Her students remembered her as demanding but kind, someone who seemed to understand fear and uncertainty in ways most adults did not. One former student, writing decades later, recalled, "Miss Hayes once told our class that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to continue living despite fear." She said the bravest people she'd known were those who built sanctuaries in darkness and waited for the light to return. We didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I've thought about those words many times since. Clara maintained correspondence with Nathaniel Reed until her death. The letters, discovered in Reed's papers after his death in 1871, reveal a deep friendship that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Clara wrote about her students, her readings, her ongoing attempts to understand what had happened to her. Reed wrote about his work, his continuing education, and his quiet efforts to help other formerly enslaved people establish free lives. In her final letter to Reed, written 2 weeks before her death from pneumonia, Clara wrote, "I have lived twice as long free as I lived in hiding. Yet I think of those 4 years often, not with horror, as you might expect, but with a strange gratitude. You gave me a choice when I had none. You believed me when no one else would. You built me a sanctuary in earth and darkness, and that sanctuary saved my life. Whatever else I have done, whatever else I have become, begins with your impossible engineering and your willingness to see me as a person worth saving." Clara died on November 3, 1847, at age 37. She was buried in Charleston's Magnolia Cemetery, and her gravestone, paid for by funds she'd carefully saved throughout her life, bears an inscription she had requested. She survived the darkness and taught others to find light. Following the 7 freed men through their subsequent lives reveals much about the challenges and possibilities of freedom in antebellum America, as well as the lasting bonds created through shared extraordinary experience. Nathaniel Reed traveled to New York after his initial months in Philadelphia, seeking opportunities in a larger city with more developed industrial infrastructure. Using an assumed name, Nathan Freeman, a choice that later correspondents reveal he found grimly humorous given his warnings against forced surnames, he found work as a surveyor's assistant. Reed's abilities quickly became apparent to his employer, who gradually gave him increasingly complex assignments. Within 3 years, Reed was performing work equal to formally trained surveyors, and by 1835, he had established himself as an independent consultant on engineering projects. But Reed maintained absolute secrecy about his background. As far as his New York colleagues knew, he was a free black man from Philadelphia with self-taught skills. The true extent of his abilities and their origin remained hidden. Reed's private papers, discovered after his death, include extensive technical writings, calculations, design proposals, and theoretical essays on civil engineering problems. He also wrote a series of anonymous articles published in technical journals between 1838 and 1845, addressing topics ranging from underground construction to structural reinforcement of foundations. Historians have identified these articles through handwriting analysis, but during Reed's lifetime, no one connected the sophisticated technical writing to the self-taught black surveyor working in Lower Manhattan. Reed married in 1841 a woman named Sarah Mitchell, a teacher in one of New York's schools for free black children. They had 3 children, all of whom received extensive education. Reed taught them mathematics and engineering principles alongside their formal schooling, creating a family tradition of technical knowledge that continued for generations. Reed died in 1871 at approximately 67 years of age. His obituary in the New York Tribune, brief and formulaic, described him as a surveyor of considerable skill and a man known for his quiet dedication to the education of young people in his community. It mentioned nothing about tunnels, plantations, or impossible engineering. His secrets died with him, preserved only in papers his family donated to a historical society in 1923. Benjamin, the blacksmith, whose skills had been crucial to creating and maintaining excavation tools, settled in Philadelphia permanently. He opened a small metalwork shop that served the city's free black community, creating tools, implements, and hardware while training younger men in the trade. Benjamin's shop became an informal gathering place for formerly enslaved people seeking advice, connections, or simply community. Abolition Society records note that Benjamin provided material support and practical assistance to numerous individuals transitioning to freedom, never seeking recognition for this quiet work. Benjamin died in 1852, leaving his shop to an apprentice he'd trained for over a decade. The shop continued operating until 1889, when it was destroyed in a fire. The neighborhood where it stood is now part of Philadelphia's historic district, though no marker commemorates Benjamin's contribution to the community. Samuel, the field hand, whose physical strength had been essential to the tunnel's construction, moved west to Pittsburgh, where he found work in the city's developing steel industry. His ability to work longer and harder than most men, combined with an emerging understanding of metallurgy he'd gained from Benjamin during their time together, made him valuable to employers. Samuel saved aggressively, and by 1845 he had purchased a small house, the first property he'd ever owned. He brought his 2 sisters from Maryland, paying for their freedom and establishing them in Pittsburgh's free black community. Census records from 1850 show Samuel living with his extended family, working as a furnace operator, owning property valued at $800. Samuel died in 1862 during an industrial accident at the steel mill where he worked. His obituary noted that he'd worked at the same mill for 17 years and was known for his exceptional strength and his quiet generosity to those in need. Joseph, the carpenter, whose structural knowledge had complemented Reed's theoretical understanding, established himself in Philadelphia as a builder and contractor. His skills were in high demand, and by 1840 he was employing a crew of 6 men on projects throughout the city. Joseph's success allowed him to purchase freedom for multiple family members still enslaved in Maryland and Virginia. Abolition Society records document at least 12 freedom purchases Joseph financed between 1832 and 1855, spending thousands of dollars to reunite his family and extended kin network. Joseph died in 1859, relatively wealthy by the standards of free black Americans of that era. His will, preserved in Philadelphia probate records, distributed property and funds among multiple family members, and donated a substantial sum to establish a school fund for black children in Philadelphia. Elijah, the younger field hand, who had served as both digger and lookout during the tunnel's construction, pursued education with single-minded determination after gaining freedom. He attended evening classes in Philadelphia while working during the day, eventually achieving literacy and basic mathematical competency. By 1840, Elijah was teaching in a small school for black children, using methods Reed had taught him during their nighttime excavations. Former students recalled him as patient and encouraging, someone who believed absolutely in education's power to transform lives. Elijah died young in 1844 from tuberculosis. He was approximately 38 years old. His students raised funds for his burial and commissioned a simple gravestone that read, "Teacher, friend, Freeman." Daniel, the stable hand, who had been the youngest of the seven, initially struggled with freedom more than his companions. At 19, he had known nothing but enslavement, and the sudden responsibility of directing his own life overwhelmed him. Records suggest Daniel moved frequently in his first years of freedom, working various jobs in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore, never settling in one place for long. But by 1835, he had found stability in Baltimore as a coach driver for a wealthy merchant who treated him fairly and paid reliably. Daniel married in 1837 and had 5 children. Census records from 1850 show him still working as a driver, living in a rented house with his family, sending his children to school that he died in 1868, having lived a quiet life that left few records, but which his descendants remembered as marked by determination to provide better opportunities for his children than he'd had himself. Marcus, the field hand, who had served as lookout and coordinator during the tunnel operation, returned to South Carolina despite the prohibition against doing so. Records of his presence are fragmentary, but evidence suggests he worked with underground railroad networks, using knowledge gained from building the Hayes Plantation tunnel to help others escape. Marcus's fate is uncertain. A report from 1845 describes a man matching his description being captured and re-enslaved in South Carolina, but the documentation is incomplete. If this was indeed Marcus, he would have spent his final years back in enslavement, a cruel reversal after 15 years of freedom. Alternatively, other records suggest a Marcus living in Canada after 1850. Possibly the same person, possibly not. The uncertainty reflects a common challenge in tracing the lives of formerly enslaved people. Records were often incomplete, names were changed frequently, and documentation was deliberately avoided to prevent recapture. What is certain is that all 7 men maintained contact with each other throughout their lives, meeting when possible and corresponding regularly, supporting each other through the challenges of building free lives in a nation still largely hostile to their freedom. Letters between them, preserved in various archives, revealed deep bonds and shared memories of the impossible thing they had accomplished together. In an 1856 letter from Reed to Joseph, Reed wrote, "I think often of those 3 years when we moved earth one bucket at a time, building something that shouldn't have been possible. I realize now that we weren't just building a tunnel. We were proving to ourselves that we could conceive of freedom and then construct it with our own hands. Every bucket of earth we moved was practice for building free lives. We learned patience, precision, cooperation, and secrecy, all skills that have served us well in these years since." The Hayes Plantation property, sold in 1831, changed hands 3 times before the Civil War. Each ownership period is documented in property records, and each reveals interesting patterns that have fascinated historians. The first owners, the Bradford family from Virginia, operated the plantation for 15 years without incident. Their records show normal agricultural production, typical labor management, and no unusual occurrences. When they sold in 1846, their reason was simple. Better opportunities had arisen in Alabama, and they wanted to expand into cotton production on a larger scale. The second owners, however, had a different experience. The Montgomery family, also from Virginia, purchased the property in 1846 and sold it again just 3 years later in 1849. The reason cited in the sale documentation was family health concerns requiring relocation to a different climate. But a letter discovered in the Montgomery family papers in 1934 tells a different story. Lawrence Montgomery, writing to his brother in 1848, described increasing unease among the house servants who claimed to hear sounds at night in areas where the old main house once stood. Several have requested reassignment to field work rather than maintain the current residence we built on the property. My wife has become similarly disturbed, claiming she feels watched when in certain locations. Most tellingly, Montgomery wrote, "I've had the old cellar foundation, where the burned house once stood, filled in completely with earth. Still, 2 of the house servants insist they hear sounds coming from beneath the ground, scratching, rhythmic movement, as though something is still there, still waiting." The third pre-war owners, the Sullivan family, purchased the property in 1849 and held it until 1865, when Union forces appropriated it during occupation. The Sullivans' records show no complaints about unusual occurrences, though a notation in an 1853 diary entry by Margaret Sullivan mentions, "Had the old foundation area covered with brick, the servants say it needed a more permanent barrier. I don't ask what they think is being buried." During the Civil War, Union forces occupied the region briefly in 1862 to 1863. A Union officer's diary from this period, discovered in a Massachusetts Historical Society in 1978, includes the entry quoted earlier about discovering the tunnel entrance. But a longer passage from that diary, not previously published, reveals more. "Lieutenant Morrison and I descended into the tunnel yesterday to assess whether it might have strategic value. The main passages have partially collapsed, but what remains is remarkable. The engineering is sophisticated, better than many battlefield fortifications I've seen constructed by the Army Corps. More disturbingly, we found evidence that the tunnel has been accessed recently. Footprints in dust, candle stubs that appeared relatively fresh, and in the deepest chamber, the one the locals say was built to hide someone, recent scratches on the walls. The scratches form words, though they're difficult to read in lantern light. Morrison claims he made out still here, and watching and waiting. I've ordered the entrance sealed with debris and posted guards to prevent soldiers from exploring further. Something about that deep chamber unsettles me in ways I cannot articulate. Perhaps it's knowledge of its history, that someone lived hidden there for years. Perhaps it's something else. Either way, I want my men nowhere near it." The tunnel entrance was sealed as ordered, and no record exists of further military interest in the structure. After the war, the property went through several owners before being subdivided in the 1920s. The former plantation land is now a mixture of residential development, protected forest, and historical preservation area. Attempts to relocate the tunnel in modern times have proven frustrating. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s identified anomalies consistent with underground voids, but excavation attempts have been unsuccessful. Either the tunnel has collapsed entirely, or it remains hidden beneath layers of subsequent development and forest growth. One detail from the 1990 survey effort deserves mention. Researchers reported unusual equipment malfunctions when working in the area where the main house once stood. Digital recording devices would produce static. GPS systems would show location errors. And on 2 occasions, surveying equipment simply stopped functioning until it was moved to a different area. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Holmes, wrote in her final report, "We cannot rule out mundane explanations for the equipment issues, magnetic anomalies in the soil, interference from nearby power lines, etc. However, the localized nature of the problems, affecting only equipment operated in one specific area, is unusual." The research team unanimously agreed that further excavation in that location would be inadvisable until equipment issues could be resolved. The equipment issues were never resolved. The survey project was shelved, and the area where William Thornton Hayes's main house once stood remains unexcavated. Its secrets, if any, remain still buried beneath decades of earth and vegetation. The story of Nathaniel Reed and the Hayes Plantation Tunnel entered African-American oral tradition within years of the trial. The details changed with each retelling. Sometimes Reed became a single hero working alone. Sometimes the tunnel stretched for miles. Sometimes Clara Hayes became multiple people Reed saved over many years. But the core narrative remained consistent. An enslaved man with engineering knowledge had created something impossible, had defied every limitation placed upon him, and had preserved life through intelligence, courage, and determination. The story became legend, a tale told to emphasize that bondage could constrain the body, but not the mind. That knowledge was power that could never be fully suppressed. That freedom could be built, even in darkness, one bucket at a time. Frederick Douglass mentioned the case in an 1852 speech, though he didn't name Reed directly. "I have heard tell of a man who, denied education, taught himself through a broken window. Denied freedom, he built it underground. Denied humanity, he proved his humanness through the impossible." This man represents what every enslaved person carries within, the capacity for brilliance that slavery tries to bury, but can never fully extinguish. The story appears in various forms in slave narratives collected in the early 20th century. Former slaves interviewed by the Federal Writers Project sometimes mentioned hearing about the tunnel builder or the man who hid freedom underground. The details are often confused, the location shifts, the names change, the dates vary, but the archetype persists. Scholars debate whether Reed's story influenced the real Underground Railroad's operations and terminology. Some argue that the metaphor of underground freedom was already well established by 1829. Others point out that Reed's literal underground construction occurred precisely when underground railroad networks were forming, and that the Charleston case received enough attention to potentially influence how people conceptualized escape routes and hiding places. What's indisputable is that Reed's engineering feat was remarkable by any measure. Modern civil engineers who have studied the documentation express amazement at what he accomplished with minimal resources, no formal training, and the necessity of absolute secrecy. Dr. James Richardson, a geotechnical engineer who published a detailed analysis of the tunnel in 1988, concluded, Reed's work demonstrates an intuitive understanding of soil mechanics, structural load distribution, and underground construction principles that typically requires years of formal education and hands-on experience. That he achieved this through observation and memorization of texts, then successfully applied it to excavate over 400 yards of stable tunneling, places him among the most remarkable engineers of his era, recognized or unrecognized. The broader question raised by Reed's story concerns what else was lost to history. How many other enslaved people possessed remarkable abilities that were never documented, never recognized, never allowed to flourish? How much genius was suppressed? How many innovations were never recorded? How many achievements remain unknown because the achievers were denied the status of persons whose accomplishments mattered? Reed exists in the historical record only because of an extraordinary convergence of circumstances, a plantation owner's curiosity, a legal case that was documented in unusual detail, and papers that happened to survive. For every Nathaniel Reed whose story was preserved, how many others lived and died, leaving no trace except in the oral traditions of their descendants? But beyond the historical significance, beyond the questions about lost genius and suppressed achievement, Reed's story raises another question that has troubled researchers for nearly 2 centuries. What was Clara Hayes fleeing from? The materialist explanation is straightforward. Clara experienced some form of psychological trauma, perhaps abuse that was never disclosed, perhaps a medical condition affecting her perceptions, perhaps a breakdown triggered by adolescent stress. Her conviction that something supernatural was hunting her was a manifestation of this trauma, given shape by the ghost stories prevalent in the culture around her. Reed, believing her fear was real, if not her literal interpretation of its source, helped her until she could recover enough to function in society again. This explanation accounts for all the facts without requiring acceptance of anything outside normal experience. It's the explanation most historians adopt, and it's perfectly reasonable. Yet it doesn't quite satisfy, because Clara wasn't the only person who experienced unusual phenomena in the Hayes house. Her mother reported them. Multiple house servants confirmed them. Even Reed admitted to sensing something wrong, and Webb acknowledged his unease when first exploring the deep tunnel. The psychological explanation would attribute all these experiences to shared delusion, cultural suggestion, or the natural human tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli as meaningful patterns. In an environment where ghost stories were common and superstition was culturally accepted, people naturally interpreted unusual experiences through that framework. Again, this is reasonable, but it requires dismissing the specific, consistent details reported by multiple people across several years. The tall, thin figure, always described the same way. The sense of being watched reported in specific locations within the house. The sounds that multiple people heard independently. The timing of Clara's mother's decline, her final warnings to Clara, and Clara's subsequent experience following the pattern her mother had predicted. Coincidence? Certainly possible. Shared cultural framework leading to similar interpretations of unrelated experiences? Also possible. But as one accumulates the documented testimonies, the weight of consistency becomes harder to simply dismiss that a more nuanced explanation considers that places where violence, suffering, and death occur regularly might develop what could be called psychological toxicity, not literal ghosts or spirits, but rather an accumulated atmosphere of dread and pain that affects susceptible individuals. Clara, living in a house built on the labor of enslaved people, maintained by violence and the constant threat of violence, might have absorbed this atmosphere and given it shape according to her understanding. This explanation preserves scientific rationality while acknowledging that Clara's fear was responsive to something real, not a literal entity, but rather the oppressive reality of the plantation system itself. Her flight becomes not escape from a supernatural threat, but rather escape from the accumulated evil of slavery, given form in her imagination, but rooted in genuine horror. Reed then becomes someone who understood this intuitively, even if he couldn't articulate it. His comment about places becoming poisoned by what occurs within them suggests he grasped that the plantation house had absorbed suffering in ways that made it psychologically uninhabitable for someone as sensitive as Clara. Building her an underground sanctuary was both literal and metaphorical, creating physical distance from the source of trauma while also providing psychological space for healing. This interpretation has gained favor among recent scholars because it allows for a complex understanding of Clara's experience without requiring acceptance of supernatural elements, while also not dismissing her reports as simple delusion. It treats her fear as responsive to real conditions, while acknowledging those conditions might have been perceived in ways that were partly interpretive, partly culturally shaped, and partly uniquely personal. But even this sophisticated interpretation leaves questions unanswered. What about the Union officer's report of recent activity in the sealed tunnel decades after the original events? What about the equipment malfunctions during the 1990s survey? What about the consistent reports across different owners and different time periods of something wrong with that specific location? Perhaps these are simply accumulations of coincidence and suggestion. Perhaps knowledge of the site's history creates expectation that leads to interpretation of normal events as abnormal. Perhaps there's nothing to explain beyond human psychology's tendency to create patterns and narratives from randomness. Or perhaps some places do retain marks from what occurred within them. Not supernatural marks, but rather persistent environmental or psychological conditions that affect sensitive individuals. Perhaps the Hayes Plantation, like many sites of prolonged suffering, developed characteristics that we don't yet have adequate vocabulary or scientific frameworks to describe, but which are nonetheless real in their effects. The question cannot be definitively answered. The evidence allows for multiple interpretations, and honest analysis must acknowledge uncertainty. What is certain is that Clara Hayes lived in terror, that Nathaniel Reed believed her terror was legitimate, and that he constructed an extraordinary sanctuary in response. Whether that sanctuary protected her from a literal entity, from psychological trauma, from the accumulated toxicity of a place built on suffering, or from some combination of these factors, the result was the same. It saved her life and gave her time to develop strength enough to eventually live in sunlight again. And perhaps that's the most important truth. Not what Clara was fleeing from, but what Reed built for her. A space where she could exist without fear, where she could maintain her humanity in darkness while waiting for the possibility of light. The Hayes Plantation site today is quiet. Forest has reclaimed much of what was once cultivated land. The location where the main house stood is marked by subtle variations in vegetation. Plants grow differently there, perhaps because of residual foundation materials, perhaps because of soil composition altered by the fire, perhaps for no particular reason. Tour groups occasionally visit as part of historical society programs about plantation life and the Underground Railroad. Guides mention the tunnel, though details are often imprecise, mixing documentation with legend. Visitors walk the approximate path from where the slave quarters once stood to where the river still flows, trying to imagine what it took to excavate that distance, one bucket at a time, one midnight hour after another, for 3 years. A small marker was installed in 2003, reading, "Near this site, Nathaniel Reed and 6 companions constructed an underground tunnel system 1825 to 1828, demonstrating remarkable engineering skill in service of preserving life." Reed and his companions were freed following the system's discovery and trial in 1829. The marker doesn't mention Clara Hayes by name, respecting privacy considerations even nearly 2 centuries later. It doesn't mention the disturbing elements of the testimony or the questions that were never resolved. It presents the sanitized version suitable for historical commemoration. But occasionally, researchers request permission to access the Historical Society's full archives, where the trial transcripts, medical reports, diaries, and letters are preserved. And these researchers emerge troubled, having encountered a story that resists easy categorization or comfortable interpretation. In 2019, a graduate student named Jennifer Martinez completed a dissertation on the case, examining it through the lens of enslaved people's resistance strategies. Her conclusion is worth quoting. Nathaniel Reed's tunnel represents a form of resistance we rarely acknowledge. Not violent rebellion, not escape to formal freedom, but rather the construction of alternative spaces where different rules applied. Reed created a location where an enslaved man could exercise agency, where a young woman could make choices, where humanity could be preserved despite systems designed to destroy it. The tunnel was not just a physical structure. It was a philosophical statement that freedom can be built even in the most constrained circumstances, that knowledge cannot be suppressed even by comprehensive systems of oppression, and that human connection and compassion can persist even in environments designed to eliminate them. Whether or not we believe the supernatural elements of the testimony, we must believe the human elements. Fear transformed into courage. Constraint transformed into creativity. Powerlessness transformed into action. Reed looked at impossible circumstances and asked not can this be solved, but rather how can I solve this? And then he spent 3 years moving Earth one bucket at a time until he had built the answer. This is resistance in its purest form. Not seeking permission, not waiting for circumstances to change, but rather constructing solutions with whatever materials and knowledge are available, in absolute secrecy, sustained by nothing more than conviction that preservation of life justifies any effort required. The dissertation won multiple awards and has been cited extensively. But Martinez reported in a 2021 interview that she still thinks about the unresolved elements of the case. I wrote about what I could analyze and document, but there were aspects of the story I couldn't incorporate into academic writing. The consistent reports of anomalous experiences, the pattern of disturbance across different time periods, the sense that something about that specific location remained troubled long after the events themselves concluded. I don't know what to do with those elements. I don't have frameworks for analyzing them rigorously, but I can't simply dismiss them either. Sometimes I think Clara Hayes was perceiving something real that we don't have adequate language for. Other times I think trauma and cultural belief created shared interpretations of normal experiences. And sometimes I think both explanations might be true simultaneously. That places can accumulate suffering in ways we don't understand, and that sensitive individuals respond to this accumulation with experiences that are genuine, even if we can't explain their mechanism. Martinez concluded, maybe the point isn't to resolve every question. Maybe the point is to honor what Reed and his companions did, regardless of what precisely they were responding to. They saw someone in terror and distress. They believed her experience was real enough to warrant extraordinary action. And they took that action, building something impossible, because the alternative was to let someone suffer and die. In the end, that's what matters. Not whether we can explain every element of Clara's testimony, but rather that Reed responded with compassion, ingenuity, and courage. The tunnel is gone, collapsed or buried too deep to find. The people are gone, their lives completed long ago. But what they created together, that space where humanity persisted against all obstacles, that remains, not physically, but conceptually. It remains as proof that no system, no matter how comprehensive its cruelty, can fully extinguish the human capacity to imagine freedom and then build it with our own hands. The tunnel collapsed long ago. The 7 men died decades past. Clara Hayes has been gone for over a century and a half. But what they created together, that space where humanity persisted against all obstacles, that remains. Not physically, but conceptually. It remains as proof that no system, no matter how comprehensive its cruelty, can fully extinguish the human capacity to imagine freedom and then build it with our own hands. A sanctuary built one bucket at a time, in darkness, in secret, sustained for 3 years by nothing more than the conviction that preserving life justifies moving Earth until the impossible becomes real. That truth remains, long after everything else has turned to dust.